Okay, Craig, so what is a crisis?
So what is a crisis? We're talking about organizational crisis, not personal crisis.
No.
So I think crisis comes in three forms, but ultimately they're high risk or high threat to our organizational output. Something that's going to impact us as we go forwards. Something that's going to stop us being able to deliver our deliverables. I think it comes in three forms. We often think about it being a big, sudden event, like an earthquake, something that we can really identify, shooting, flooding, fire.
But that is a crisis, right?
That is absolutely a crisis.
Yeah. Easy to identify.
Easy to identify, and we call that sudden crisis. This is something that's going to absolutely impact us going forwards, and it's easy to identify. We might have known about it, it might be sudden, it might be a shock, but what's happened is, it's there, it's happened. Easily identifiable crisis.
Yeah. And second, what is that?
The second one would be called a smouldering crisis, or a creeping crisis. This one generally hits organizations a little bit down the line. This is something that might be identifiable if we dig into it, but is often unseen. It can be a bunch of decisions, like a chain of individual incidents that don't necessarily create a crisis in itself, but maybe they haven't been dealt with correctly as we go forwards, or mismanagement is quite a common one. And they lead to a crisis at the end of it. Commonly, a smouldering crisis would lead to something like reputational damage or mismanagement, financial deeds, something like that.
Those could be harder to identify or actually see when should we mobilize our crisis team.
Absolutely. Often they'll remain unseen until the implications of it are upon us.
Could we take COVID, for example? Could that be like a smoldering crisis?
I think COVID could have been a smouldering crisis, but it was also known crisis, and this is where we start to blend things here. But certainly it was a smouldering crisis. We saw it starting to raise in China. We then saw it appear in Italy, in Lombardy in Italy. But there were a lot of decisions and a lot of ambiguity into it, and I think something surrounding crisis is ambiguity and a lack of knowledge or ideas of how to go forwards because we don't know the impact. We're in the unknown often with these crises. So yeah, I would say COVID was an example of a creeping crisis. We saw it coming, lots and lots of different decisions led the way for this to happen. But ultimately it was uncontrollable when it did hit us.
Yeah, and probably not possible to avoid, even though we had...
Absolutely, not possible to avoid, but possible to prepare for.
Yeah, correct.
So which I think leads us into the known crises. So this is the one where we often ignore, and as often we don't see them come about because we know it's likely to happen, and we've done something, we've prepared, we've increased our capability to adjust to that, often within the security risk management processes that we've got in play. So it's a crisis that we know could happen, we prepared for it, but actually it's going to hit us regardless of how much we prepared for it or not. But the known crisis is something we can absolutely know is coming, we can set ourselves onto the right footing and have a good foundation to deal for it.
Right. So the baseline of why is it important to know all this for an organization then, would you say?
I think it's really difficult for an organization to identify what a crisis is for them. And I think it's really important to know that, so when we can sit down, we can know when we're in crisis. Or the irony of crisis management is we don't want to initiate crisis management. We want to stop it happening in the first place. So if we know what a crisis is, what it looks like for our organization, we can aim off and prepare ourselves to stop it happening in the first place, or at least reduce the impact of it when it does hit.
Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you.
So what does a crisis plan, what's the content of a crisis plan, so to speak?
Yeah, good question. So the content of a crisis plan is absolutely anything you need it to be to manage yourself out. But it starts off with checklists, essentially. Have I got this right? Have I got my communications channels right? And what is my team? It starts to consider the makeup of the team, because the best person for the place, for the job may not necessarily be your daily manager. You may need certain competencies, certain skill sets. But equally, the crisis plan gives you a process, something that is practiced and a way to manage yourself out of it. Because you're working in ambiguity, you're working under stress. It gives you a handrail to follow. They can be as complex as you want them to, but we work in simple. So it's simple enough to help you manage your way out, a handrail or a process to manage your way out. We're not talking, like I said, a 200-page document. But you can have a number of crisis plans, and we'll call that a crisis portfolio. But that's not necessarily important for a majority of organizations.
Got it. And it also includes definitions of what a crisis is to our organization, right?
It absolutely does. Because a crisis is different for every organization. So if you whack out the crisis plan and it ticks all those boxes, then you'll find yourself in a crisis. But actually, you may not reach the threshold of being into a crisis at that point, and then you continue your business as usual management processes. But it's at what point do we recognize that we are in a crisis, and that should absolutely form the foundations of building a crisis management plan.
But it sounds like a really hard work to get this plan in order, right?
It doesn't have to be. You know your business well, you've got a skilled management team, and it's about identifying the threats that could have an impact onto your assets. What assets do you have? And it can be actually really interesting, thought-provoking process, because you might identify assets that you hadn't thought about, and it might change your daily practices. It might enhance your business processes as you go forwards. So it can be really simple. Just look at your assets, what's the impact going to be, and how do I manage my way out of that should the worst happen?
That's a good way to put it. I think that work itself could be pretty interesting to do, actually.
I think so. It'll form the basis of understanding your business. What assets do you have? And we're talking tangible and intangible. So you might actually start to identify some unique selling points for your organization as a whole that don't represent crisis, but actually represent business value for you and your clients or customers.
Yeah, I worked before in another organization. They had like what you described, like a 200-page crisis plan, and no one actually used it when it came to crisis. It was too complicated, really.
Too complicated.
Yeah.
Simplicity is the key. The shorter the document, the better, but it needs to be something that you can pick up without any knowledge of the organization and manage your way out of crisis.
Thanks.
Thank you.